there. Let's talk about time-lapse and hyperlapse. What's the difference? Well, you saw both in the intro. Time-lapse refers to a sequence where the camera is stationary and the subject is in motion. This is a time-lapse. Hyperlapse refers to a sequence where the camera is in motion. The subject may or may not also be in motion, but the key to a hyperlapse is that the camera either physically moves its position or changes its direction of view during the sequence. This is a hyperlapse with the camera physically in motion. This is a hyperlapse where the camera is in a stationary position but changes its direction of view. Let's start out talking about using a typical DSLR or mirrorless camera to do the job. Later I'll show you some alternative camera options that you may like to take advantage of as well. For a time-lapse sequence, you need to get your camera into a position where it will take photographs from. That can be as simple as placing it on the ground or a table, or it could mean using a tripod or some other type of stable mounting system. If you're doing a hyperlapse sequence, you can simply handhold the camera and move it, or you can use a variety of mounts. You can use some sort of body mount to attach it to you while you move. There's also a wide array of vehicle mounts that you can use to attach a camera to a moving vehicle. You can use a slider. There are several out there that are motorized and will move at a speed that you set as your camera takes photos for your sequence. You can also use a rotating mount. There are several different types, and you can even make use of a star tracker if you have one. Most star trackers have a hyperlapse mode where you can adjust the rotational speed of the star tracker, and many of them even have a built-in function so that you can use this USB port to connect to the camera via USB, and then you can allow the star tracker to actually trigger the camera as it moves. This can be especially handy if you have a camera system that doesn't have a built-in intervalometer. The software and the hardware of the star tracker system take over that for you. You can program all your information into the star tracker software, and then it will move the camera at the speed you want it to, and will also take the pictures for you by triggering the shutter via the USB port. As I just mentioned, there are some cameras with no built-in intervalometer functions. If that's the case, you do need to rely on an external device that can do that. There are separate remote trigger cable releases that are programmable, as well as other external devices such as motorized sliders, star trackers, etc., that can handle the job if your camera can't do it on its own. Let's talk about camera settings now. The first thing to think about is that a time-lapse or hyperlapse requires a lot of individual images if you're going to have a sequence that lasts any more than a few seconds. When you put together a time-lapse or a hyperlapse, the typical frame rate that would be used when you render your final video is 30 frames per second. That means that for every 30 images your camera captures, you get 1 second of movie in the end. If you want to make a 30-second time-lapse or hyperlapse, that means you need 900 images if you're going to run it at 30 frames per second when you render it. By the way, I'm using 30 frames per second as a reference because anything that you put online on sites such as YouTube will be played back for the viewer at 30 frames per second. So for technical reasons, it's often best to render your hyperlapse or time-lapse at 30 frames per second to avoid glitchy looking playback when people watch your creation. The point I want to make, though, is that it's going to require that you capture and then process a large quantity of images to make your final creation. That means you don't want to spend a lot of time and fill up a lot of space on your cards and on your hard drives by shooting in RAW format for a time-lapse or a hyperlapse. Remember, if you publish your creation online, it will typically be viewed at dimensions of 1920 by 1080 or smaller at 72 ppi. Shooting raw files for this is overkill and will slow you down tremendously. I always shoot my sequences in JPEG format. In fact, I don't even shoot in JPEG fine mode. I shoot in lower resolution JPEG normal mode. Even those files still need to be reduced in size to put a time-lapse or hyperlapse together. So by shooting in the lower resolution to start with, I don't eat up as much space on my memory cards, I don't use up the buffer in my camera, and my computer system does not have to work as hard or as long to process the files. While I'm talking about capturing a lot of images for time-lapse or hyperlapse, another thing I want you to consider is that your camera will need to run continuously, sometimes for a very long length of time, especially if you're making a night sky time-lapse or hyperlapse and each individual exposure is long. Your camera may need to run continuously for several hours. Your battery may not be able to keep your camera powered up for the length of time needed, and you may need to consider an alternate power source. A battery grip with extra batteries in it is an option. This particular one holds 2 additional batteries, and therefore, when attached to the camera, there are 3 batteries that the camera can run through. Some cameras allow an option to plug in a dummy battery, such as this, that can be connected to an external power source. This particular one can be plugged into an AC electrical outlet via this transformer adapter, or it can be plugged into an external power bank battery. Now you need to be aware that many modern cameras will not turn on unless the battery door is closed. Therefore, your battery door needs to have an access port for the cord to come out from the dummy battery while the battery door is closed. Some cameras have this accommodation, as you can see here. However, some people that want to use this option have actually been known to drill a hole through their battery door to accomplish this. Be aware, that will certainly void your warranty. Some models of cameras will also allow you to power the camera through its USB port. That allows you to use a large power bank battery such as this, or an AC electrical wall transformer unit such as this, to keep your camera running as long as you need to during a recording session. If you're lucky enough to use certain brands of cameras, such as what I shoot with, your camera will have all of the options I showed you available to you for maximum flexibility. Once you set up your camera to have enough power to last through a session and set up to record images in JPEG format, then you'll want to dial in the rest of your settings as normal and take test shots until you're happy with the result as a starting point. I suggest that you manually choose a shutter speed and manually choose an aperture. If you have concerns about the light and your exposure changing during a sequence, then I suggest that you use auto ISO to account for that, because in the final rendering of your video, variances in ISO will not be as noticeable as aperture changes or shutter speed changes that could occur while recording your images. If you were to shoot in aperture priority with a fixed ISO and let the camera vary the shutter speed, then variances in the amount of motion blur occurring during the sequence could be noticeable. If you shoot in shutter speed priority with a fixed ISO, then changes in depth of field during your sequence could be noticeable when your aperture changes. Motion blur and depth of field won't visibly change during a sequence if you allow the ISO to be the value that varies to accommodate your chosen exposure value. Now that you have all that other stuff figured out, it's time to determine your intervalometer settings. The first thing you want to consider is the interval between the end of one exposure and the start of the next. If you have a fast camera and a fast memory card, you can set your interval to be as small as 1 second in between the end of one shot and the start of another. Take into account, though, that if your camera is slow, or your memory card is slow, or you have your camera set for long exposure noise reduction, then you have to take those items into account and set the interval between shots to have a long enough gap to allow the camera to process and write a file before it takes the next exposure. You may want a longer interval between shots simply based on the subject matter that you're recording. For the driving and walking sequences that you saw earlier, I had a 1-second interval set. For night sky photography, I will often set a longer interval, such as 10 seconds to 30 seconds, to allow the resulting gap in time to show more motion of stars, clouds, etc. Depending on what you want to depict in your final creation, you may even want an interval as long as several minutes or even hours. Time-lapse sequences of flowers blossoming, for instance, often have very long intervals between shots. The next consideration is the number of shots that you want to take. Typically, you can program a desired number into the camera or the auxiliary device that's controlling the camera, and recording will stop when the desired number of exposures have been taken. Some cameras give you an option for an infinite number of shots, and then you can simply let the camera run as long as you want until you either manually stop it or until its batteries or its power source dies. Oftentimes, when I'm camping, I will set a camera up, point it at the sky, set the number of exposures to infinity, and let the camera run all night until I wake up or until the batteries die. I also do this a lot during meteor showers, not necessarily to create a time lapse, but simply to have a few hundred or a few thousand images to look at in the morning and see if the camera captured any meteors without me needing to stay up and babysit the camera all night. Some cameras or devices may also give you an option to delay the start of the time sequence. That's helpful if you need to set up the camera in a location in advance and don't want to go back to it to start recording at the proper time. An example of this might be if you're camping somewhere and want to make a night sky or a Milky Way time lapse, and the best vantage point for the sky is not where you're actually camping. You could hike out to the camera location late in the afternoon, dial in all your camera settings, and then program the camera to start recording on its own after it gets dark. Now that you know how to set the camera up and can record a sequence, let's go to the computer and see how to process your images and turn them into a time-lapse or a hyperlapse video. The first thing that we want to do is to import a series of images from the camera that are going to be the source for our time-lapse or hyperlapse. The next step typically is to take the first image in your sequence and make the necessary adjustments to it. In this case, there's no exposure difference between this and all the rest of the 900 shots that are there. So I can make my adjustments, and then I'll be able to synchronize the adjustments from this image to the rest of the 900 images that are going to be used to create this particular time lapse. All of the images in this sequence were recorded in the camera's native aspect ratio of 2:3, but I'm showing this to you separately because it's an option you might want to consider, and that's changing the aspect ratio to a 16:9 cinematic format. I'm going to go ahead and do this now and synchronize that crop to all of the images in the sequence. Now, of course, if you wanted to, you could do this when you do your original adjustments and only need to synchronize one time. This next step is of critical importance. Even if your images come out of camera in sequence by name, Photoshop tends to not like that and won't put them together properly. You do have to rename them in a sequential order before you take them into Photoshop. Now we're going to export the files with the proper settings to create an HD time-lapse video. You're going to save them as a JPEG, 1920 pixels on the long side at 72, and adjust the quality to your liking. Now we are ready to open those images in Photoshop to create our time-lapse video. Here's the procedure. Choose File, Open, and navigate to the folder that contains the images that you exported from Lightroom. Only click on the first file and then check the box that says Image Sequence. Choose a frame rate, in this case 30 frames per second. You'll notice it's the default. If your Photoshop is not set up to show it, check the timeline option. A representation of your video will appear at the bottom of the screen that you can work on. Now let's make this night sky sequence a little more interesting by adding some dramatic cinematic music in the background. Take your audio track, drop it onto the timeline underneath the video in the audio track location. You can use the scissors tool to trim the audio to match the length of your video. I also want you to know that while you're in Photoshop, you can make adjustments to the video in pretty much the same manner as you would a standard still photo. In this case, for demonstration purposes, I'm putting a curve adjustment layer on it. When you're all done, click the menu at the right side of the timeline and choose Render Video. You'll get a menu with some export options. Go ahead and give your creation a name. And until you become more advanced at this process, you can leave the rest of their values at their default settings. When it finishes rendering, you can play back your file and enjoy your masterpiece. Now, let's talk about a few options that you can take advantage of to speed up the process of creating a time lapse or a hyperlapse. There are some kinds of cameras out there that can take the shots and process the video and save a lot of time for you. Action cameras, such as this GoPro, have built-in time-lapse and hyperlapse functions that you can program, and as soon as you're done taking the shots, it processes them into a video for you in camera, and you can play it back immediately and see how it looks. This Osmo Pocket camera is stabilized with a 3-axis gimbal and also makes time-lapse and hyperlapse videos internally. Most decent cell phones now also have that functionality built into them. I use all of these tools to create time-lapse and hyperlapse videos. In fact, during this demonstration, I've shown you sequences made with DSLRs, mirrorless cameras, a GoPro action camera, an Osmo Pocket stabilized camera, and my cell phone.